Welcome back to the second part of my squad leading tutorial. Before we get going, I'd like to thank everyone for the support and the feedback that they left on the last video. It definitely got a lot more attention than I was anticipating, and it was really cool to see even OWI share it. This guide is definitely going to be getting into the juicier bits, so I hope you guys like it just as much. Hopefully, you've already watched the first video in this series. If not, the playlist will be linked in the description below. This intermediate guide is aimed at people who have watched the first video, who have led at least a few squads, and are starting to feel less overwhelmed by the role and ready to take on some new information. This video is going to follow a very similar format to the last one. I'll be walking through the three roles of the squad leader and expanding on each of them. Due to the shortage of time in the first video, I was making a lot of vague statements with very little evidence to back them. In this video, I'm going to start explaining my reasoning so that you can start recognizing exceptions to what I say and making your own informed observations and opinions. To start, I want to talk about flag sustainability. When deciding which objective to support, you should always be pushing towards the flag that looks less sustainable. Let's revisit the same scenario I mentioned in the previous guide. Here's a situation where you and your squad are en route to the two active objectives. Whenever you're in a situation like this, you should analyze your defense objective first. The first step to determining how sustainable it is to look at your spawn points. Does it have an FOB? If not, chances are it won't last very long. If it's currently taking no contact at all and there's more than one squad defending it, you might be able to get away with supporting the attack objective instead, but it's still a big risk. If the objective does have an FOB constructed outside of cap range, check to see if it's been detected by the enemy. If people are dying shortly after spawning, pay attention to the direction they were looking when they died, and make your best guess as to how close the enemies are to it. A defensive fob outside of the objective that has been detected will almost always fall. The question is usually when, not if. Even if the fob doesn't fall due to the sheer number of friendlies spawning on it and defending it, too much attention is being spent on a firefight outside of cap range. The flag itself is in a more vulnerable state than it should be. Even if there is an active, undetected FOB, it's still entirely possible that flag isn't sustainable. If you're noticing that attackers are making it to the edge of cap range, that flag is in danger. A healthy defense should never allow enemies that close. Similarly, if you see people confined into a small area in cap range like fish in a barrel, it's really only a matter of time before that flag falls. If the defensive fob is inside the objective, or it's entirely undetected and safe, and your team is sitting in cap range, pay attention to how much ground they're covering. A healthy defense will have friendlies outside of cap range, into the hills surrounding the objective, all without leaving any flank particularly exposed. If you're noticing contact on one side of the objective, you can usually rest easy knowing your defense objective is in good shape if you see friendlies pushing back into the contact and keeping the fight far from cap range. The only exception to this is if they're leaving massive amounts of ground open for enemies to sneak into cap range undetected from a different angle. Rally points are also important to analyze. Do the defending squads have safe rallies tucked away, or are they limited to a single fob directly on the flag that can easily be overrun without any secondary spawns? Flags can even be unsustainable if they're not taking any contact at all, depending on the competence of the people defending the flag. I've seen countless examples of squads piled together sitting on a hill outside of cap range, all looking in one direction. It doesn't take a genius to recognize that an enemy squad can easily make it into cap range in situations like that. If your defense flag is not sustainable, it should be your priority. Exceptions might include situations where you're already taking the attack objective and you recognize that you're likely going to cap it before your defense flag will go neutral, or in situations where the game is absolutely lost if you don't take the attack objective and you need to be piling your resources there for any chance of victory. If your defense objective is sustainable, you should be checking the sustainability of the attack objective. Rather than explaining what I mean here, I'm going to use this to segue into a new topic that will eventually cover it. I want to talk about stalemate games. In the previous video, I explained how objective captures work in Advanced and Secure quite thoroughly. However, games aren't always decided by flag captures. In most games, one team will make steady progress capturing the other's flags, gaining tickets all the while, and will win by a comfortable margin because of it. However, there are some games where neither team advances into the other's territory. Even in situations where one team makes significant progress on the other's flags, the tickets they gain can almost be perfectly countered if the losing team pushes them back to the midpoint. Even with the reintroduction of ticket bleed, this will leave both teams almost exactly where they started, as it's still pretty mild. When V12 removed ticket bleed, made changes to the ammo system, increased the effectiveness of armor, and added more open maps, defense-heavy strategies became much more common than they were in previous versions. I have referred to V12 as the turtle meta patch. Even now in V13, we're still feeling the effects that V12 had on the community, and I'm still seeing a lot of stalemate games without many objective captures. Games like these are determined by three main factors: each team's kill-death ratio, each team's vehicle losses, and each team's FOB losses. Let's take a look at how you can analyze each of these, starting with KD. Because squad matches are so large scale, the average shooting ability of the team tends to average out quite nicely. It can still be swayed if one team has a few more clans and the choice of faction could play a small role, but all of that is out of your control and won't massively affect the outcome of the match. The more significant changes to your team's KD are far more situational than that. The first thing I want to discuss is the defender's advantage. To put it at its most basic level, defenders generally have a slight to moderate KD advantage over attackers. I'll go into the whys of this in the advanced part of the guide later, but the important thing to remember is that in sustained conflicts between attackers and defenders, most of the time the defenders will sap more tickets from their enemy. This isn't noticeable if the flag is captured, as the ticket value of the flag, the spawn point, and everybody giving up after a squad wipe will usually drastically outweigh the slight KD advantage that the defenders got beforehand. But in a game where both teams are incredibly defense heavy and both attacking forces are drastically outnumbered and never take the flag, this can play a massive role in which team wins. You'll start to see this a lot, where both teams take incredibly defensive strategies to heart, and one or two attacking squads from each side will never really make any ground. They'll continue to bash against the defenses from the same angle over and over and over. Oftentimes they'll create a fob that will inevitably end up being a complete meat grinder, constantly draining tickets for your team, and they'll refuse to flank, fall back, leave the fob, or make any attempt to change their strategy. These types of squads will drain both teams' tickets, and the winner will often be whichever team is pouring fewer resources into these unsuccessful attacks. As a counterpoint to this, there are situations in which defenders can start suffering from a KD disadvantage without necessarily losing the flag. Some HABs can be inherently difficult to take down, but also notoriously dangerous for people spawning on them. You'll often hear these referred to in-game as Because the V12 added the 30-meter HAB disabling radius, generally there's only a fairly short period of time in which HABs are being absolutely pounded before they're overrun and destroyed. You will still find some situations, though, where the HAB is in a position that's easy to shoot into, but difficult or undesirable to approach. Defenders will be frantically giving up and respawning, trying to keep the attackers at bay, constantly afraid that they're about to be overrun. Reviving will be near impossible, as people are being murdered directly outside of the HAB, and the KD will shift heavily in favor of the attackers. These situations are inherently unstable and will, like I said, tend to resolve quite quickly with either the spawners pushing back or the attackers making it into the disabling range. But I've actually seen a game won by a combination of two friendly squads and a mortar constantly hammering a poorly placed fob on the enemy's midpoint that their entire team was spawning on. Despite being completely pushed in and being forced to run into enemy bullets to escape, the defenders still largely outnumbered the attackers and were able to hold the HAB and objective through sheer manpower and the attackers' unwillingness to push in. All the while, they were being completely massacred within the walls of their compound by well-placed friendlies and relentless, accurate mortar fire. No doubt they were giving up and respawning all game in a panicked frenzy, trying to make sure that our team didn't take the objective. This was a stalemate-style game, and the enemy team wasn't attacking our flag. Despite Our team never taking theirs and spending significantly more tickets on offense than the enemy, we still won by a comfortable ticket margin because of that hab. Keep in mind that this is a fairly rare situation, and it's difficult to deliberately replicate as an actual strategy. I'm mostly including it as a counterpart to explain an example in which the theory of the defender's advantage might not hold any merit. As I said before, I'm making an effort to explain the why in these later guides, behind my advice and observations, so that you can also understand when they don't apply. So, now that you know how to recognize them, what can you do to win these types of matches? If you're attacking, it's as simple as recognizing if your offense is unsustainable and then either changing it or leaving it once you come to that conclusion. If you're defending, then things get more complicated. You can try to explain the situation to your fellow squad leaders and try to organize a defense-only strategy. This is arguably the most effective approach, but it requires more cooperation than your average public game will be capable of. It's relying on your teammates being experienced enough to recognize that you're correct, disciplined enough to disengage from a fun firefight in front of them, and responsible enough to make sure that the rest of their squad does the same. If even one squad leader goes against the plan, the benefits are almost completely negated. Pure defensive strategies can be very, very strong, but they are very difficult to pull off in a public match. If you're defending with another squad, you might weigh your options and consider the consequences of leaving the flag in the other squad's hands to make an assault on the attack objective from a new direction. That meat grinder fob is likely pulling enemies off of the objective, and your manpower can make the difference, especially if you come in from a new angle. At this point, even if you hold that defense objective all game, you still stand a significant chance of losing if the attackers never take that flag. Doubling down and showing an actual effective attack on the next objective could potentially take it and make up for the tickets lost on offense thus far. Of course, this is also entirely situational. During the time in transit, it's possible that you'll start losing your defense objective, having underestimated how many enemies were there. It's also possible that the meat grinder attack fob will fall, getting rid of your distraction and support, and then leaving your 9-man squad to deal with the obviously heavy resistance alone. It's also worth considering the actions of the enemy team. Obviously, you've held this point. Have you done just as good a job at grinding out their tickets, crushing enemy attempts at attacks? Or has the resistance been light, meaning that the enemy team isn't attacking much and is benefiting significantly more from the defender's advantage? You won't always be able to win matches like this. There's only so much that one squad can do. Regardless of how much you'll be able to affect the actions of the other squads, it's important to have a reasonable estimate of how your tickets compare to the tickets of the enemy team at any given point in order to make the best decisions for your squad. So what about the next thing in the list, vehicle losses? They aren't nearly as expensive as they used to be, but they can still add up over the course of a match. If you have a very good tank squad that managed to destroy both enemy tanks twice over, then you've put them at a 60 ticket disadvantage. That's enough to make up for an entire flag loss. There's not a lot that you personally can do to manage this if you're not running a vehicle squad, but there are some small things. Be aware of the ticket cost of the vehicles that you are running. There will be an entire section dedicated to this later in the guide, but don't forget to analyze the cost of everything that you use. If you come across enemy vehicles, you should be weighing the benefit of denying the enemy an asset against the benefit of taking enemy tickets. In the very beginning of the match, if you manage to destroy an enemy's fob on the midpoint and you capture a Logi in the process, just destroy the engine and the tires and leave it there. It's far more valuable to deny the enemy 1/3 of their logistics capability than to take 5 tickets from them. But if you're deep into a stalemate game and you're running low on tickets, then you definitely want to destroy every single vehicle you come across. It could make the difference. Even if you're not actively protecting or destroying vehicles, keep an eye out for how the armor game is going. If you're losing heavily, you may need to adjust your playstyle as infantry to make up for those tickets that are being lost. As for the last point I made with the fob losses, honestly that was more of a technicality than anything else. I knew that if I only included infantry and vehicles, some wise ass in the comments would mention that fobs were also worth tickets. I don't really take fob losses into consideration when I am calculating how many tickets the enemy team has. I consider radio losses to be kind of extensions of squad wipes and objective losses in terms of how I'm perceiving them. The only time you should really be considering it as its own separate entity is if you're trying to drop a radio and you don't have supplies handy, or you're in a precarious situation. If you finally get those two guys to you and then you get mowed down right after you place your radio, then you're down 10 tickets. That being said, I usually do not let the 10 ticket cost of radios influence me when I'm deciding whether or not I want to place an FOB. I'll let it influence me if I'm deciding whether or not to do it before I have supplies handy, but generally speaking, the benefit of having a spawn point will almost always outweigh the potential risk of losing 10 tickets. In order to predict the enemy tickets more accurately, I tend to play a game, usually with my squad or my clan, in a majority of matches, and I kind of recommend you pick it up as well. Just try to guess the ticket difference and who's going to win as the game starts to come to an end. It's particularly interesting in close matches where you're not sure if you're going to win or lose. Even if you're not actually discussing it with people, just take a look at how the match played out and make your best guess. You'll be pretty far off at first, but obviously, as you start gaining experience with making these sorts of observations, your guesses will be closer and your game knowledge will grow. Even if you're not squad leading, always observe how matches play out. Eventually, you'll learn to see patterns and how to exploit them. Another thing I'd like to speak about in more depth is what you should be doing during a double neutral. In the last guide, I recommended treating a double neutral as if each team swapped roles. You're now defending their flag while attacking your own. That is still technically true, but there was a significant change. Each team can now stealth cap their own flag back. It still takes 3 men, so it's not like the standard 1-man stealth cap and backcapping, but it is the same in that they can cap it regardless of how many enemies are occupying it. I think that this change was made to persuade both teams to fall back and emphasize the recovery aspect of the double neutral, as well as to make them more unstable and more likely to resolve themselves. Or it could have just been a bug that made it through testing, but it's been in for 2 versions now, so I'm pretty sure that it's here to stay. Either way, what does it mean for you? If you're the attacking force that neutralized the enemy's flag, your job has become more difficult. You need to make absolute sure that not a single enemy enters cap range. Please note that almost everything I say here is applicable to rush strategies in the early game, as you have almost the exact same goal. You need to keep a flag neutral despite the enemy being able to take it with either 1 or 3 men in cap range, regardless of how many people you have there. The first step is to recognize the precarious situation that you're in and have a backup plan ready. Make sure that you have a vehicle ready and can quickly fall back if you reach the point of no return with enemies capturing the flag. This is mostly going to involve communicating with your squad members and making sure that they're aware exactly of what's going on. Tell them that it's only going to take 1 enemy soldier to cap this point, and there's no way we can remove this progress once they've started. Explain that they need to be watching every direction to be sure that nobody sneaks in. Explain that if somebody does start capping, everybody needs to drop what they're doing, even if it's engaging contacts further out, and immediately start searching every corner until he's dead. Make sure that they're aware that they're going to need to be ready to drop what they're doing at any point and run back to the truck if too many enemies make it in and start capping, and there's no chance that you're going to be stopping them. It's up to you to recognize that point and make sure that people aren't wandering so far off that getting them back to the truck in a timely manner will be too difficult. If you're the defending force that got pushed off of the flag, your job got a little bit easier. All you need to do is perform a stealth cap as long as your attacking squads are still holding their objective hostage. As long as at least 3 of your squad members are able to remain alive and undetected for long enough, the flag will be yours. Once that's happened, you can check the sustainability of the next flag. If your team is going to capture that one immediately after, then you could probably move up to support it or hit the next objective in line. If your team might lose it, then you should probably focus on clearing more enemies out where you're at and preparing for it to become the old defense objective. Don't forget that just because you're able to stealth cap an objective, it doesn't mean that you'll be able to hold an objective once the rest of your team loses the other neutral point. One quick side note to do with V13. In randomized advanced and secure, the enemy flag that you're holding hostage will vanish during a double neutral. You'll still be holding it, and they'll still have to get 3 people in it to cap it back, but you won't have any indication on the map or on your screen for when they're attacking or where the flag cap range is. Furthermore, your defense objective will continue to show that it's being captured by hostiles, if it was being captured when you neutralized yours. It will flash red even if you're still holding their objective. It's buggy as hell right now, so you have to use your best judgment to determine if enemies made it into cap range and keep a sharp eye on your defense objective for confirmation that they capped. Another thing that I didn't get the chance to cover as well as I would have liked to in the previous video is Invasion. At its core, it's a very simplistic and linear game mode. There's a lot less to mess up as a squad leader, which is why I think that so many people love it. That being said, there are some mistakes that I still see made all of the time. An extremely common mistake that I see the defending team make is giving the enemy free flags. The thing about Invasion is that most people have the completely wrong mentality when they look at this game mode. Their thought process is something along the lines of, we need to stop the enemy from capturing all of these flags. Which flag is the most defensible? Where do we stand the best chance of holding them out? Okay, let's move to that flag and start building an FOB to increase the defensibility of that point to increase our chances of holding them there. Once the enemy arrives, we'll be set up and prepared for the assault and thus able to hold them out until they're out of tickets. The thing that they aren't considering is that every single flag the enemy captures is giving them 60 tickets. This is not like Advanced and Secure, where they gain 30 and you lose 30. They're actually gaining 60 tickets per flag capture. It is absolutely imperative that you bleed the enemy enough at each flag to negate or lessen that ticket gain, even if you're not preventing them from capturing the flag. Now, I have spoken poorly about super fobs in this guide already, and all of the things I've said about them apply to this mentality as well. Even the most well-constructed defenses will only marginally increase the defensibility of the point, if that. Most of it is going to come down to how well your infantry has dispersed around it, their sight lines, and whether or not you're leaving any flanks exposed. If you can keep them fighting for every inch of ground well before they've reached cap range, without leaving other paths open to be exploited, then you're doing way, way better than you would be if you were sitting on the inside of a machine gun nest constructed on the flag, mindlessly shooting while your position is entirely surrounded. Even if by some miracle, given the amount of time you had to prepare, you make an incredible improvement to the defensibility of this flag, it will never be enough to make up for all the flags you handed away for free, especially if you take into consideration the tickets you could have gained through killing enemies trying to capture them. Because defenders win on Invasion when the assault stops at a certain flag and the attackers run out of tickets, and because the attackers' tickets aren't displayed for the defenders, it gives people a very, very false impression of how Invasion games are won. They constantly see an enemy unable to overcome a defense, and then try their hardest to replicate that exact same scenario on the exact same flag. What they fail to see is how much progress before that point affects the outcome of the match. The number of tickets you can take away and the amount of time you hold enemies at each prior flag holds just as much, if not even more weight, as how well you do in that final flag. I remember a game of Invasion like this on Kohat, where my squad was the only one actively making it to the front line. My team had decided for whatever reason that Bahadur was the flag that they wanted to hold. My squad was able to make it to Hengu and get a fob up as the enemies were arriving. We fought tooth and nail against the enemy team, with only the support of a handful of blueberries that defied their squad leaders and spawned up here to help us. We did not hold the flag, but we took enough tickets from the enemy to potentially negate the advantage they got from it, and we slowed them down by about 10 minutes. We repeated this process on Connolly and Nazrat with varying amounts of success. By the time we get our fob up on Ali Abad, a little bit more of the team was spawning there with us. When it was eventually overrun, Bahadur fell hilariously quickly, due to our squad being the only one leaving the flag and the hill west of it to slow down the attack. We were unable to hold them off the east hills, and once they had them, they turned it into an absolute turkey shoot. They quickly disabled our HAB through proximity and took the point. Before we lost Chakar, the enemies were out of tickets. We didn't win the game with a flawless defense on a single objective holding the enemy at bay for an hour. We won the game through constantly, consistently, and effectively draining their tickets and timer at every single point for the entire match. If we never left Bahadur, the enemy would have arrived there with an extra 240 tickets. That would have doubled what they started with, and they would have swept over it in seconds, with a much, much better chance of taking the next 3 objectives. It would have been nearly impossible to stop them at that point. Instead, they arrived at Bahadur with limited resources and limited time, and they felt every single ticket loss and minute go by. Imagine how much more effective our strategy would have been if it was our entire team doing it. In most games on this layer, in which more than 75% of the defending team makes it to Henggu or the next flag, I have never seen the game progress past Nazrat. The enemy team simply loses too many tickets taking the first few flags. In Invasion, the defenders have most of the map available to them during the staging phase. The invisible wall is normally quite close to the first defensible flag. With the entirety of staging phase at your disposal to get there, beating the enemy to the first defense flag is usually fairly easy. Take advantage of that if you want to win. Create your squads quickly and move immediately. I see fewer massive mistakes being made by attacking teams, but there are still some common ones. The first step is obviously to be moving between objectives effectively and attacking objectives effectively. I'll be covering those 2 topics later on in this guide. Another mistake I see attackers occasionally making is overextending. This is most common early game, where attacking squads don't think the enemy team is capable of making it to the first flag and they leave it to one squad. This is a risky move. It can sometimes pay off and it can sometimes ruin your match. I've seen countless teams fly by Henggu on Kohat or radio station on Narva, only to be shocked when the one squad sent to cap it is entirely wiped. Sometimes getting to flags like Ring Road and Old Barracks early enough to really dig into them before people have arrived and set up their defenses is worth the risk of leaving radio station to one squad, but if you choose to do this, you should always be ready to turn on a dime and prioritize the held flag over getting a favorable position on the next flag. Another important thing to understand about Invasion, whether you're an attacker or defender, is when to move to the next flag. I'll cover this in the mobility section of this guide. Seeing how I'm talking a lot about Advanced and Secure and Invasion, it's really only fair that I mention Insurgency. If we're being completely honest, I probably haven't played more than 10 Insurgency games since V9. Servers just don't put it in the rotation. It has been neglected game mode for as long as it's been in the game. The developers are well aware that it's almost entirely unplayed, very imbalanced, and just not that fun right now. So they'll likely be making some changes to it in the future. And once that happens, I'll be more than happy to play it some more and make a video on it. But until then, I'm going to give it the silent treatment as well. And of course, with V13 came a new game mode, Destruction. From a strategic standpoint, it's not all that different from Invasion. One of the core differences is that your defense isn't determined by outnumbering the enemy team in a specific zone, but by preventing specific enemies from moving into one spot in particular. Because of this, I keep a close eye on the cache and try not to let people wander as far as I would in a basic flag defense. Having people well dispersed can be a big benefit when defending flags for a few reasons. It starts engagements with the enemy further from cap range, which is always a good thing, and it's still fairly easy to recover and pull people back if you start leaving the cap too exposed and the enemy sneaks in, as you get to see the cap range start to drop and you have plenty of time to react to it before the objective is neutral. In Destruction, you don't get any second chance. If an engineer makes it to the cache, it's done. There is no pullback the enemies are capping. They simply get that engineer in there once and it's gone, which is why you need to keep your infantry a little bit tighter than you normally would. One of my favorite strategies on this game mode is just to drop a rally point directly on the cache so you can see immediately if it gets squashed and people move in, and you can immediately have everyone acting on that. Beyond this, the strategies for building spawn points and defending or attacking caches are very similar to Invasion. The last thing I'd like to touch up on under this topic is communication. I kinda blew by it in the last guide, so I figured I would elaborate here. When it comes to communication with your squad, there are a couple of things I would advise you to remember. First of all, it's important to act confident, even if you're not. If your squad doesn't think that you know what you're doing, they're going to start making their own decisions, and that is not going to be easy for you. I didn't really want to include too much shit like this in this guide, kind of sappy, lead by example, act confident, that kind of bullshit. Seems like kind of default advice that people give when they really don't understand anything about squad leading. But this is very important. It's already hard to get strangers to communicate and cooperate, and if they don't think that you know what you're doing, they're just going to eat you right up. Just make sure that you aren't getting so into it that you'll then refuse good advice or stubbornly stick to a failing plan. Because I play with a clan, I don't necessarily follow this rule myself. If I'm indecisive about something, I'll generally voice my concerns out loud to hear the opinions of everybody else. When I decide what to do, I will announce it, and I'll kind of vocalize the risk that we're taking in picking this option over the other. If down the line you're playing with people you know, this can be an interesting way of running things a bit more democratically and learning as a group. This is an alternate approach that you can take towards running your squad if it's something that's more in line with your personality as well, though you might see mixed results if you're doing it with randoms. The second thing I would advise is that you communicate your intent, not just your orders. You're giving orders because you have a goal in mind. If you share that goal with your squad as well as your orders, your squad can then take the initiative to adapt their actions to meet that goal, even when the orders are no longer relevant. This is actually a big pet peeve of mine in the real world, as it's often seen as the fault of the follower, not the leader. Here's an example of that, which also fulfills my pop culture reference quota for this video.
Your instructions were to wait for him to come to you.
I seized an opportunity.
What value was the mill?
The mountain was garrisoned across the river from it.
Is he there now?
Of course not. We took the fight to him. He could not withstand us.
I wanted to draw the mountain into the west, into our country where we could surround him and kill him. I wanted him to chase us, which he would have done because he is a mad dog without a strategic thought in his head. I could have that head on a spike by now. Instead, I have a mill.
Everyone's quick to shit on Edmure here, but I would have put the blame on Rob. If the intent was communicated rather than just black and white orders, things would have gone very differently here. Let's also talk about communication between squad leaders. I'd like to reiterate the importance of what I said in the last video. Do not spam command chat. Use the direct function whenever applicable, and always think about what you have to say before you say it. Rounds with noisy command chat drive me insane. I start playing worse, I start snapping at people, and I start ignoring important callouts, or just being completely unable to hear them. The most important things to communicate are when you're capturing a flag, losing a flag, moving to or leaving a flag, and taking down or losing an FOB. Obviously, it's important to communicate your plan in the staging phase as well. If you're leaving a defense flag, do not just tell people, but try to get confirmation that somebody is staying. Once you gain some experience, your callouts can be a bit more specific. For example, let's say I'm strongly outnumbered, but I am beginning to capture a flag. I can recognize how precarious that situation is, even if another squad leader looking at the map can't. If the enemy's FOB is in a better position than mine, and I know that they have more people spawning, I can recognize that my situation isn't sustainable and that I'm likely not going to be able to fully neutralize this flag. That won't change until either I take down their FOB or gain reinforcements. For that reason, I'm not going to announce to the team that I'm capturing the flag. Instead, I'll tell them that I'm unlikely to fully capture it without support, so that they don't read the map and make decisions based on the notion that I'm going to take it and start leaving objectives that are still going to be important. Another thing that's worth communicating is when you find an enemy spawn point. If it's an FOB, mark it and announcement. If it's a rally point, mark it and announce it. Once again, once you're more experienced with the game, you can get more specific with these callouts. Usually, given how familiar I am with people and how they move in this game, and how aware I am of the typical FOB placing meta, I can determine where the enemy has set up their FOB by looking at the movement of enemy troops. This is especially prominent on smaller maps and around the midpoints, where most of the action occurs, and I am most familiar with the maps. If you have a rough idea of where you think the FOB is, mark it and explain in command chat that it's just a prediction based on enemy movements. One of the most important and overlooked aspects of communication is communicating with your team's armor. This is something that drives me mad when I'm running any form of armor squad. If you have eyes on an enemy tank, you need to immediately communicate that to your tank squad. Use the radial menu to get an accurate mark on it, place an appropriate marker on the map, and then use direct comms to let your armor squad know. Do not forget to include what direction it's facing, as that is incredibly important in tank combat. The big disadvantage of armored vehicles is their lack of awareness. They have powerful cannons, but they have very high levels of zoom. They have very cluttered optics, limited viewports, loud engines. All of this really severely hinders them. There is nothing more powerful than one person with good view over enemy armor guiding in friendly armor. You can tell them exactly what to expect, where to be, where to aim, and exactly when they're in danger. In V12, my squad managed to kill a Bradley with a single BTR-82 using that exact method. Those of you who are familiar with the marshmallow shooter that was the 30mm in V12 should understand what a feat that was. I was on the ground telling the BTR exactly what to do. It pulled up, looked down the street, engaged the Bradley from behind, killing the engine. The BTR backed up along a predetermined route the moment I gave the word that the turret had been rotated to face them. Both crew members dismounted and were promptly killed by me and another person on the ground. I called the BTR back to finish the Bradley off. See, if I was in the BTR there and I didn't have infantry telling me exactly what I was telling them, I never would have approached the Bradley. It's just a stupid call. Only with perfectly precise information was the BTR able to stay in cover, pull out onto that street and engage while not being looked at, and then pull back the moment they were looked at. The perfect example of communication between infantry and armor, giving armor a massive advantage. I've seen some squad leaders roll into a flag and get absolutely decimated by enemy tanks. They then complain that their tanks, which are maybe 300 meters away, aren't also in the point helping them out. Meanwhile, they've either completely failed to communicate the location of enemy tanks or have given something as vague as, the enemy tanks are over here, in command chat. Now they expect the friendly tanks to storm in and defeat them. Don't forget that in this situation, if the friendly tanks storm in the exact way as the enemy tanks, they're throwing away a perfectly good advantage. Who's to say who will come on top? Maybe our tanks will win, maybe theirs will. Chances are that if the friendly tanks are instead loitering around the outside out of audio range, then they're waiting on good intel. If you're the one to give them the exact tank markers and tell your tanks what direction they're facing, or maybe even look around and recommend a spot where they can get a sneaky shot off on them, you're going to help your friendly tanks absolutely cripple the enemy armor. And then at that point, they can be on the objective with you as much as they want. I'll save more of this for my tank guide, but it's very important as infantry that you understand how combined arms work and how imperative your role is in tank-on-tank combat. You need to cut some slack for the tankers who are trying to engage from an advantageous position rather than demanding that they charge in blind, throw a coin, maybe win, maybe lose, whatever. I've seen too many situations where infantry squad leaders are just foaming at the mouth, demanding armor support, blaming everything on the friendly tank squad, rather than actually recognizing that the enemy tanks are being stupid if they're going to come in there and knife fight with infantry and trying to capitalize on that mistake and bring in the friendly armor to punish them for it. Now this video is dragging on quite a bit longer than I anticipated, so I'm actually going to be cutting it here and splitting the intermediate guide into 3 separate parts. As I said in the beginning, my initial intention was to focus very heavily on mobility in the intermediate guide, and that's still true. The entire next 2 videos are going to be focusing entirely on that topic, but I did have to include a little bit more of this awareness as I wasn't quite able to fit everything I wanted to in the beginner guide due to the number of introduction topics that I had to address. In part 2, I'll focus on why mobility is so important and exactly how you should be moving across the map. And then in part 3, I'll be focusing on the types of vehicles you should be picking, as well as FOB placement, which is an absolutely massive topic. So stay tuned for those, subscribe if you haven't already, and I should have those out within a reasonable time frame, though these do take quite a while to make, so please have some patience. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. If you have any concerns or feedback or questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. I'll be watching all of that, and I'll see you guys in the next one.